Alors, quoi? Annie, bonjour. Hi. Je m'appelle Marie-Ève Blackburn et je suis assistante de recherche pour Environnement Réseau pour la recherche en santé autochtone du Québec. Nous aimerions commencer ce webinaire en remerciant nos panélistes qui ont accepté de partager avec nous et avec vous aujourd'hui le travail de recherche qu'ils effectuent. Nous tenons également à remercier toutes les personnes qui sont présentes dans l'auditoire et qui partagent notre intérêt à alimenter les discussions sur les pratiques prometteuses qui favorisent les environnements de recherche par et pour les premiers peuples. Je me trouve actuellement en territoire non cédé, Nistaskinan, Ndakina et Nitassinan. Cependant, comme notre public et nos panélistes proviennent de plusieurs endroits du territoire connu aujourd'hui sous le nom de Québec, nous vous invitons à partager dans le chat les peuples autochtones qui ont façonné le territoire sur lequel vous vous trouvez aujourd'hui. Si vous avez besoin d'aide pour connaître ces peuples, vous pouvez toujours consulter le site nativeland.ca afin de vous informer du nom du territoire et des communautés, peuples qui ont façonné le territoire sur lequel vous vous trouvez. Je passe la parole à Audrey pour vous expliquer ensuite la façon de faire pour l'interprétation.
Yawa Marie-Ève. Donc, je vais juste faire cette petite partie-là en français, comme nos panélistes aujourd'hui vont parler en anglais. Comme à l'habitude, la traduction simultanée, elle est disponible. So simultaneous translation is available, but our panelists are speaking English today, so you might not need it as much. Donc, dans le bas de votre écran, vous allez voir une petite planète, un petit globe sous lequel il est écrit « Interprétation ». At the bottom of your screen, there's a little globe under which is written Interpretation. Vous cliquez sur celui-ci et vous choisissez le canal linguistique qui vous convient. Donc, vous cliquez sur le petit symbole. So you click on this little symbol and you choose the linguistic channel that meets your needs. If it's not there, you just click on more and interpretation should be available for everyone. Sego, my name is Audrey and I am Research and Capacity Enhancement Agent for the Quebec NEAR. I've been working for the organization for 2.5 years now. And I'm really glad to co-host this webinar today. So I hope you all had a great week and that you are enjoying the change of colors and scenery that fall brings every year at this time of the year. So this is the third episode of okay, I'm just going to start again. Sorry. We welcome you to our third webinar this fall of our series, Practical Examples of Research in Indigenous Contexts. As a reminder, in this series, we highlight research projects carried out entirely by Indigenous communities, organizations, and individuals. This is the case of the two group of panelists we are welcoming today. So as a first group, I'm really pleased to welcome Mercedes Yanes Lane, who's a research coordinator, Jennifer Morrow, Planning, Programming, and Research Officer, and Mary Munger, who is an administrative process specialist for the CRI Health Board of the CRI Health and Social Services Board of the James Bay. I will now give them the floor, the virtual floor, if we can say it like this, and I will remove myself from the conversation. So go ahead. Exactly. So thank you so much for this presentation. It's really great to see the work you've accomplished during your moratorium. Is it how we say it in English?
Yeah.
And I look forward to see how it will be applied in the future. This is really exciting. And I hope also that many communities can see how this work can be achieved and be inspired by your initiative. Thank you so much, Miigwech.
Thank you.
So if you could stop sharing. And the last pin. So now I will leave the floor to Maureen Gustafson. Oh, you went so fast. And Christina Lahopoulos, who are representative of Mamow Ahyamowen. And this is another community-based alliance that I'm really excited to share with our audience today. So go ahead.
Thanks so much. And just to confirm, you can see the slides, right? Okay,
Yes.
cool. Thank you. So hi, everyone. First off, we just want to say merci. Thank you so much for the invite. It was really great to hear a little bit more from our colleagues about some of the work going on in the James Bay area. And we're excited to learn together and share some more about the work we're doing in Northern Ontario. So we'll start off by introducing ourselves. So I'll say Ani Maureen Nishnaka Shakanashimam, Nibokan Mediro Gishika Nishnaka, Skojing Ishtakadi Ishkonigan. So my English name is Maureen, my Anishinaabe name, and I'm a member of Couchiching First Nation. I grew up just outside of there in a small town called Fort Frances, and I have mixed Anishinaabe and settler roots. I'm excited to be joining you here today, and I'm a knowledge translation specialist for Mamow Ahyamowen, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. So I will pass it to Christina to introduce herself.
Thanks so much, Maureen and Ani. Bonjour. My name is Christina Vlahopoulos, and I'm of settler Greek ancestry, and I am the research project manager for Mamow Ahyamowen, and I am situated in the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory and the traditional lands of the Atikameksheng Anishinaabe First Nation, also known as Sudbury. So thank you very much for allowing us to join you today in this really important webinar. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Mamow Ahyamowen. We're going to give a bit of the background. We're going to talk a bit about our work. The Learning from Our Ancestors is the title of our main project that we completed to date that we're going to go over a little bit. We're going to talk about the impact and significance of this work. And then, of course, what's next for Mamow Ahyamowen. So back in 2016, 7 First Nations health and social service organizations came together out of a common shared need to have access to high quality health data for the communities that they served. In Ontario, often communities would have access to information through public health units and what were called local health integration networks. But First Nations-based health and social service organizations just didn't have access to the same information, nor did First Nation communities have access to this information. So that's why these organizations chose to come together to be able to access some of this information. Mamow Ahyamowen is a Cri, OG Cri word that loosely translates into meaning everyone's voices, which is kind of a really great way to describe what the Alliance represents, which is, bringing data together and bringing data together for the collective voices to provide a bigger picture when it comes to health and well-being. Since 2016, the 7 organizations have grown to these 11 organizations that are on the slide. And the organizations, as mentioned, are a blend of health authorities and tribal councils, and they work together on common goals and interests. It's important to note this alliance is not a legal entity, and it's governed by steering committee representatives from these 11 organizations. So there are 2 steering committee representatives from these organizations, and they're the ones who guide us in terms of the work that we do and the decisions that are made on behalf of the Alliance. So because we have a predominantly Quebec audience, this is might be a really helpful map to see not only Ontario, but more importantly, the 78 communities that make up Mamow Ahyamowen. So collectively, those 11 organizations on the previous slide serve these 78 communities across Northern Ontario. The communities span from the Ontario-Quebec border, so it's interesting to hear from our co-presenters about the James Bay communities on the Quebec side, because we do work with communities on the James and Hudson Bay side on the Ontario side. So we have communities that span all the way from one end of the province to the other, towards the Manitoba border. And the communities go as far south as the communities between Sudbury and Sault Ste. Marie. And this was a deliberate decision by the group. They wanted to ensure that the voice of the Alliance was specifically a Northern Ontario voice. And that's mainly because the needs of the communities in the north can vary, and they're very different compared to the needs of communities in the southern part of the province. Some cases, some of the communities are only accessible by plane, and in some cases, some of the communities are accessible only by ice roads during certain parts of the year. And we like to overlay a map of Western Europe onto the map that we just showed in the previous slide. When we do this, it really gives folks, particularly policymakers, it gives a better appreciation for the vastness of the geography that spans this alliance. And while there might be some similarities between the communities in Northern Ontario, when you look at this map, you can really get an appreciation for how the needs of the people within the communities could vary. So for example, when you look at a community that might be in Italy on the map, the people who live in Italy are going to have different needs and different services compared to, say, for instance, a community up in the Netherlands. And so this image just really highlights the importance that we can't paint all communities with the same brush and expect that their needs to be identical. And as mentioned, this is really important for policymakers who just might not really be able to understand the vastness and the challenges of the geography, and for those living in the north. Things like access to healthcare and specialized services and the high cost of living, these and other factors are going to be different across communities. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maureen to talk a little bit about our work.
Thanks, Christina. I think you gave us a good overview about the history of the partnership and why we came together, but we also like to talk a little more specifically about what the work we do is, like what's the concrete kind of stuff we get up to and how it benefits community. So basically, we work with communities and organizations to find, analyze, and interpret data in response to questions that they have prioritized, following a culturally respectful path. And we will break this down throughout the presentation. The first thing we want to break down is the word data. And many of you will already know this, but we'll go through it just to make sure we're on the same page. The word data is actually the plural form of the singular noun datum, which really just means a piece of information. So when we bring more than one piece of information together, it becomes data, and we can talk about it, and we can use those pieces of information for reference or analysis to better understand something we might have questions about. So the word data can have a lot of negative connotations for communities for very valid reasons. So we always like to start off by talking about how we understand the word data to make sure we're on the same page. And as you'll all know, there are various types of data. We generally use what's called administrative data in our work, which is basically any form of personal information that was originally collected for a purpose other than research. So for us, it's usually health administrative data or data that was collected within the healthcare system. So every time someone in Ontario interacts with the healthcare system, anything from going to the doctor, visiting the emergency department, or getting a blood test, there's information about that visit or interaction that's recorded somewhere. So we use the health administrative data in the work we do because organizations and communities have told us that they want to know what kind of data about us is already out there and to exert their sovereignty over it rather than collecting new data. And so when organizations and communities have questions about the health of their people, we work with an organization called ICES, which is formerly known as the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, to figure out what kind of health administrative data is out there that relates to their question. And we already talked about why we use that type of data. So once we figure this out, then we link this data from the healthcare system to data from what's called the Indian Register. that's maintained by Indigenous Services Canada. So the Indian Register has personal and demographic information about all registered status Indians in Canada. And when we link these databases, we do so in a way that prescribes to First Nations data sovereignty principles as well as privacy laws. So any information that could be used to identify people, like names and health card numbers, are removed. We get aggregate level data, so people can't see, you know, Maureen Gustafson went to the hospital for stomach pain on November 14th or something like that. It's aggregate level data, but it still tells us very important information. Again, another note on ethics and privacy. We could spend a whole presentation talking about this, and we have done that before. But just for people to note that the ability to link ICES data with the Indian Register is contingent on approval from the Chiefs of Ontario, which is the provincial governing body for advocacy and political forum for First Nations across Ontario. They work to ensure that Indigenous data sovereignty principles are maintained and upheld. And so that linkage can't happen without permission, and they have procedures and policies, just like our co-presenters shared earlier, tailored to their context that they ensure are maintained and upheld. We also have our own internal policies and procedures that have been put in place by the organizations that are part of our alliance. So there is a lot of safeguards in there. So once these data sets are linked, assuming everything goes through those processes and we get the okay, we can then find people from our communities who are in both data sets to learn more about their health and to answer the questions that communities and organizations have brought forward. And I will hand it back to Christina to talk about the first project that we have completed using the kind of methods that I just outlined.
Thanks so much, Maureen. So early on in the meetings, when the Alliance was first forming and when they came together, there were a number of people who were part of those meetings, and they all had various priorities. So some folks wanted to take a look at cancer, some folks wanted to take a look at diabetes, some folks wanted to take a look at renal failure, et cetera, et cetera. And in those early meetings, after a lot of the discussions, the group then kind of decided that they wanted to take a look at the mortality experience of members from Mamow communities. And the reason why they chose this is because it touched on all of those key areas that folks had identified as being sort of key priority areas that they wanted to look at. And the topic was broad enough, and at the same time, it did touch on those priority areas. When we looked at members from communities who passed away, when we did this project, we looked at members who passed away between the years of 1992 and 2014. And you'll notice on the slide that it says 59 out of 74 communities opted in. At the time when we were doing this project, there were only 74 communities who were served by Ahyamowen, but the key number is 59 opted in. And so what happened was, for this project in particular, we had what's called an opt-in process. So we ended up going to the steering committee, and then the steering committee subsequently went to all the communities and said, we have this potential project, would you like to participate? And it was up to the community to decide whether they wanted to participate or not. And if they chose to participate, then we had to have, as Maureen mentioned, some of those procedures and important paperwork signed and filled out in order for us to be able to use their data. This is typically done through what's called a band council resolution. And so these are the key pieces of paperwork in order for us to be able to do this work. And so the things that we looked at when we explored this analysis is on the slide. So we did look at rates of death, premature death, causes of death, and conditions people had when they passed away. And so again, it was just really important for communities to express that self-determination and decide whether they wanted to participate, knowing what the project was going to be looking at. And then that's when we got the appropriate approvals for it. And so I'm going to turn it back to Maureen to talk about some of the knowledge sharing products, which our co-presenters talked about, which is such an important part of the work.
Thanks, Christina. Yeah, was great to hear that there was such a strong focus on knowledge translation, and that's something that we feel is really important as well, because from an Indigenous perspective, there's no point in engaging in research if the knowledge isn't going to be applied. So I like to tell people when they ask, what's your job? And I say knowledge translation specialist, like what the heck does that mean? Basically, at the end of the day, my role is to help make sure that the knowledge that we produced is used in a meaningful and positive way, because there's absolutely no point in doing research otherwise. Basically, it's making sure that research doesn't just sit on a shelf and collect dust, because so often that seems to be what happens. As our co-presenters mentioned, often there's a lot of effort to get knowledge out to an academic audience, but not necessarily to a community audience. So we'll run through a little bit about what we did for the Learning from Our Ancestors project. And yeah, we hope to do very similar things for our upcoming work as well, which Christina will cover toward the end of the presentation. So one thing that everyone or all communities and organizations got from this project was a report. So you can see that there's little images of the reports on the right side of the screen. The maroon one is an alliance level report. So it has data, aggregate data from all of the communities who participated combined together. And that's available on our website. We also prepared reports for each partner or organization. And they have data from every community that organization serves combined together. So they're sometimes we also refer to them as regional reports. And where possible, we also prepared reports for each of the communities who participated with just data from their members. Those are the blue reports. We weren't always able to do this because there are some privacy restrictions that make it really challenging for communities with very small populations to do this, but we did it whenever we could. And the one thing we like to emphasize is that the organization and community level reports are not available to the public through our website. They actually belong to the communities and the partners that they're about, and only they can decide what to do with them. And that's part of that First Nations data sovereignty movement. So some organizations, for example, the Sioux Lookout First Nations Health Authority or the Winnebago Area Health Authority, have those reports on their website, but others have chosen not to share them. And again, it's about respecting and recognizing their right to self-determination and deciding what's best for their community. Oh, I forgot to say one more thing. We also have made an effort to go beyond the reports because we know not everyone has time to read like a 30 to 60 page report. So we put together presentations and interactive slide decks. We have put together a whiteboard video that's more for a lay audience that can be shared through social media. It's a few minutes long and it's a very high level overview in a very digestible and accessible way of the findings of the project. We try and make infographic summaries where we can. We are looking at publishing and we're planning on publishing in an academic journal, but that's not our primary focus or goal. We've prioritized other activities over that. So those are the knowledge products that we've kind of focused on. And I just shared a snippet here of a page from the report to show you, give you a sense of what it looks like. So the reports are designed in a way that they can be easily used and applied. They have very accessible language, so we try not to make it too wordy or academic, and they're highly visual because, again, when you open up a report and you can just see lines and lines of text, that can be very frustrating and intimidating. So we tried to make things highly visual. So this means that hypothetically readers should be able to pick up the report, go through it, easily find what they're looking for, and take out some of those findings to use however they're going to use them, which I will talk about more in a minute. And here's a piece from the companion reports. We won't spend too much time on this, but I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but in addition to those 3 levels of reports I talked about earlier, we also have what we are calling companion reports. Basically, these reports were a way to share data from every participating community side by side. As you can see on the horizontal axis, the names of the communities have been removed to preserve their anonymity. In the reports, we numbered the bars and gave communities their numbers so that they could see where they fell in relation to others without compromising anonymity. But this, yeah, like I said, allows communities to better understand how they're doing in relation to others for each indicator. So on the screen here, you can see this graph specifically looks at premature mortality, the percentage of deaths that were considered premature, but we've done it for every single indicator in each of these reports. What's also important about this is that it helps us to highlight the variation that exists between communities, which we feel is really important. And Christina kind of touched on this earlier when she was looking at the maps, but so often researchers and policymakers rely on these summary statistics to kind of lump a big group of communities together, either in a region or an entire province, which kind of paints them all with one brush and masks the ways that they're unique. So you can really see in this graph how looking at an average isn't necessarily sufficient. So the average in this graph is the middle maroon bar there is 61% of deaths that were considered premature. But if you look at all the gray bars that represent each community, you can see that the community with the lowest percentage of premature deaths was just over 40, whereas the highest is just over 80. So that means the highest community was double the lowest, essentially. And this really means that while there might be a lot of similarities between communities, the factors contributing to premature mortality in those two communities are likely very different in some ways too. So it's important to have this community level data and also to be able to show the variation between communities and avoid those one size fits all approaches. As many of you know, though, writing a report or putting together slide decks isn't enough. We have to actually engage with audiences in a way that helps organizations and communities achieve their objectives. And this is, again, where my role comes in. So, you know, not just having a report, but figuring out how are we going to actually share that report with the people who need to see it. So this is where some of the other things came in. So we used the slide decks that we created during interactive workshops and presentations, which allowed people to ask questions or to ask about what results meant, or to really reflect on what the numbers meant to them in their lives. Some partners asked us, or organizations rather, to do media or press releases in order to help raise awareness about some of the inequities that the project uncovered. Looking at academic conferences, but again, that's not our priority. We've kind of done a few webinars like this one, which help reach different audiences. And we're also using social media now to reach folks, which is exciting. So that's just a snapshot of some of the knowledge translation and exchange work we do. But again, it's really, really important to us. I'll go over impact and significance quickly. Hopefully you've picked up a bit of why we feel this is important throughout the presentation. But when we believe when data is collected, analyzed, interpreted, and shared in a good way, organizations and communities can use it to inform advocacy and decision making, which ultimately supports their self-determination as a whole. When we follow these processes, they're actually more likely to make use of the data because, like I said in the previous slides, all of what we're doing is done very intentionally and strategically to meet their needs and their goals. Of course, as mentioned earlier, or we like to really emphasize, this data is only one piece of the puzzle, alongside stories about people's lived experience, traditional knowledge and teachings, and other kinds of information that should all be considered when we're making decisions about the health of communities. But we know today, policymakers and researchers really do value that quantitative data, right? Unfortunately, those other forms of knowledge aren't always as respected or as valued in our society. But this is, you know, what we can contribute as an alliance. And in case you're curious to know more about what this actually looks like, we have conducted a bit of an evaluation to help us understand exactly how the data is being used. And based on the findings, we know that the way organizations make use of the data falls into three broad categories. So the first is supporting funding or grant applications. So we've heard from a lot of steering committee members as well as other staff at the organizations that they use these reports constantly in applying for all sorts of different kinds of grants or funding opportunities. Often they're through provincial or federal government grant opportunities for all sorts of issues like people experiencing homelessness, so housing initiatives, and all sorts of other really important things. And we try our best to keep track, but we know that we can't capture all those things because there's just so much that's happening, which is really encouraging to see. Because again, there's no point in doing that if we don't have that information. And it's also used to inform planning at the program and organizational levels. And then there's also some organization-specific initiatives that the data is used for. I don't know if we have time to go over them today, but it's really important for us to understand how the data is being used. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Christina though to talk about what's next, and then we'll have time for questions.
Thanks, Maureen. So before I get into what's next, I just wanted to highlight one important key difference to Ahyamowen specifically. And that is, and I failed to mention this earlier on, and I thought it was something that's really important to mention. So unlike having a researcher come to this group of First Nations-based health and social service organizations, and say, similar to what the previous presentation talked about, say, we have this research idea, we want to work with you, can we work together? In this case, it was these organizations themselves that mobilized themselves and said, we need access to this data. They're the ones who came together and at a grassroots level put together this alliance. And then they were the ones to reach out to, at that time, they reached out to one specific researcher to help with the mortality analysis, because obviously they don't have the capacity to be able to do this work. But at the same time, again, I just wanted to make a point that it was these organizations that came together and formed this alliance. It wasn't the other way around with the researcher coming to them with a research question. So we completed the Learning from Our Ancestors report that Maureen had mentioned. We, back in January 2019, similar to the previous presentation, how they talked about going over the findings with those important people from the organizations and the communities to get that rich context to the data. So we had a session back in January 2019 where we looked at the data with the steering committee members and with community members. And after taking a look at that data and talking about the data, the group decided that it wanted to take a deeper dive into three main areas, which are the three that you see on this slide: chronic conditions, mental health and addictions, and injuries. And at this point in time, we've initiated and we're pretty far along with respect to the chronic conditions analysis. I'll ask you to go to the next slide, Maureen. Thank you. This kind of sort of shows a bit of a timeline in terms of the chronic conditions analysis and where we are right now. So we defined the scope with communities. We've drafted an analysis plan, which we shared with the communities and got those important Band Council resolutions or approvals from the communities. We've built a team with the technical expertise. We've held ceremony because we strongly believe that research is ceremony and it is important to honor the people behind the data. We've had some preliminary analysis, but as mentioned, we've had for this analysis as well, we just held in July, we had what's called a co-interpretation gathering. So at this gathering, we had, again, steering committee members and members from the communities come and have an in-person meeting where we could take a look at the data and, as mentioned, provide that really important context to the data, because it's one thing for us to look at the numbers, it's another thing to have the context behind the numbers, which can help to tell a little bit more of the story behind the numbers. So right now, in terms of the Chronic Conditions Project, we're at a phase where we are hopefully inching closer to the knowledge sharing part, and that should be coming soon-ish, fingers crossed. In terms of the mental health and addictions analysis, this project in particular is just a few steps behind, and we're hoping to have that similar gathering where we can look at the data with the steering committee and community members in the new year. And again, that will be an important part because mental health and addictions is an important topic. Again, we're really looking for that context behind the data. And in terms of the third project, the injury analysis, that is one that we currently have on pause. The two projects alone it's a significant amount of work for our small but mighty team of 4. So we've put that one on pause for the time being, and we hope to initiate that one in the not so distant future. So I believe that's everything for our presentation today. We do also have, as Maureen mentioned, we have our social media sites and our website and whatnot. So please feel free to follow us on social media. You can subscribe to a newsletter that goes out approximately twice a year, and we look forward to some great questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I was really excited to learn more about your current projects and the whole process of putting these projects together. So this is really exciting. I think that Marie-Ève might have some questions prepared for both the group of panelists. So I will give her the mic. And if anyone else in the audience has questions, comments, please feel free to raise your hand.
Audrey, this is Mary from the Cri Health Board. Is it okay if I just slip our documents into the chat?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. I'll also include some links to our website.
Thanks.
Ben, merci à nos panélistes de ces expériences fortes, enrichissantes et de les avoir partagées avec nous. J'avais une petite question pour Maureen et Christina. J'ai vu que vos rapports étaient en 2019-2020, étant donné la pandémie, l'effet de la pandémie. Donc, on soupçonne qu'il y aura des changements probablement dans l'état de santé des différents membres des communautés. Est-ce que vous avez en tête de faire d'autres rapports ou vous en êtes actuellement dans la collecte de données pour actualiser un petit peu vos rapports?
Yeah, so my French isn't 100%, but I'm pretty sure I understood most of what you said. Hypothetically, it should be better, but yeah, I can kind of take a stab at it. So yeah, the first report did come out in 2019, which was right before the pandemic. And the timing was challenging in many ways. So it's been 5 years since then, which is wild. And we do certainly hope to be able to run that analysis again and get updated data on that so that we can understand where things are now. One thing that has been a bit of a challenge, though, and Christina might be able to speak to this a little bit more than I can, but one of the challenges is that when we connect the data from the system with data from the Indian register, the data that we get from the Indian register, which again is maintained by Indigenous Services Canada, isn't always as up to date as we would like it to be. So even if we were able to run those analyses again and get new data from the health system, we might not be getting new data from the Indian register, and therefore we might be missing people. So that kind of inhibits our ability sometimes to be able to get new and updated data. And of course, because we're dealing with the federal government, there are just lots of barriers to being able to get updated data. Just bureaucracy tends to move slow, obviously, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows. So Christina, I don't know if there's anything you want to add, but yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks, Maureen. I think that was really well said. And again, the other challenging part with working with administrative data is it's never real-time data. There's always going to be a delay, even not just accessing the Indian registrar, but even accessing other data sets. By the time ICS gets the data, cleans it, de-identifies it, and then it's ready for use. Some data sets, the turnaround time can be quite quick, but some data sets, it does take a little bit of time. So, but as Maureen mentioned, the goal has always been to repeat the mortality analysis to see if there have been any changes. And of course, the pandemic just slowed everything down. So, there'll be some time before we actually repeat that analysis to look for differences.
Merci de vos réponses. Je ne veux pas non plus prendre toute la place. Je ne sais pas s'il y avait d'autres personnes qui avaient des questions. pour nos différents panélistes.
Yeah,
Je vois
I
qu'il y a
saw the
des
group's
questions.
presentation.
Mercedes, you said something?
Sorry, I think there was a bit of a lag. Sorry, I didn't mean to overlap, Mariam. So I just wanted to clarify as well, just listening to this great presentation from Maureen and Christina. Thank you for sharing. And I just wanted to, on our side, just say, as I mentioned, my office really does research and focuses on research, but the Cree Board of Health also has a public health surveillance department that does very similar work to what Christina and Maureen have described. But I know that it's for a lot of First Nations, they're usually intertwined, research and surveillance, and just in our case, they're separate. I just wanted to clarify that, and I think if there's ever any interest, it would be, I think the surveillance team would also be very, very happy to talk about what they do and how they collect data for Eeyou Istchee as well.
Thank you so much for this. Well, I'll drop the survey in the chat. Donc, je vais déposer dans le chat le questionnaire qu'on dépose à chaque webinaire pour ceux qui voudraient nous donner leur rétroaction. So I just put our survey, feedback survey that we do share at every webinar. So please feel free to fill it out. If there are no more comments, I think that everyone is busy. It's a very busy time of the year, so I will not hold anyone back longer. Thank you so much for everyone to be here, for our panelists. Thank you, Maria, for co-hosting with me. And I hope that everyone will have a great day and a great end of the week, and see you next month.
Thank you for having us. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
So much for the invite.